On YouTube, one can find a plethora of videos criticizing the supposed neo-colonial approach of France towards its former African colonies. But the actual atrocities of the French during colonial times are often overlooked or only partially mentioned. This dearth of information, especially in the Anglophone media, might lead to the belief that French colonial rule itself must have been relatively mild. The resentment of former French colonies towards their old rulers is therefore often met with a callous and hostile attitude from the outside world, which is ignorant of the horrifying history underlying these anti-colonial attitudes. In this video, we will present you with a few sobering examples of the crimes of colonial France. Let us start with French Equatorial Africa, a massive colony in Central Africa that spanned an area containing the current countries of the Republic of the Congo, the Central African Republic, Gabon, and Chad. In the late 19th and early 20th century, this colony was known for its large-scale rubber plantations, especially in Ubangi Shari, an area that is now known as the Central African Republic. According to Adam Hochschild, the author of King Leopold's Ghost, these rubber plantations were so incredibly violent many Congolese people who had previously fled from the Congo Free State to the French colonies felt they were out of the frying pan but into the fire. In fact, many of them fled back to the Belgians to escape the French. Crimes in the region included torture, cutting off limbs, inserting dynamite into bodily cavities, mass rape, and roasting children alive. An exact death toll is unknown, but it is estimated that these areas saw a population decline of around 50%. Due to international outcry, France was forced to send renowned explorer Pierre de Brazza to investigate the widespread crimes against humanity. The report compiled by Brazza was subsequently suppressed by the French government, and the abuses continued well into the 1920s, long after the demise of the Congo Free State of Leopold II. This was not the only atrocity in the late 19th and early 20th century in sub-Saharan Africa. In 1898, Paul Voulay and Julien Chanoine set out on a military mission to conquer the area around Lake Chad. As part of a series of different military missions undertaken to unify several areas in West Africa and put them completely under French control. The orders and directives given to Voulay by the French colonial minister were so vague it was, for all practical purposes, a carte blanche to wage war as Voulay saw fit. Due to these lax instructions and a lack of funds and provisions, the army column quickly started looting and plundering the villages they came across. Any villagers that tried to resist or flee were shot on sight. The mission quickly descended in an orgy of massacres, pillaging, looting, and raping. With many villages, the marauding army encountered razed to the ground. Word of the mass-scale atrocities reached the French minister, who feared Voulay and Chanoine had become completely unhinged and might start pillaging areas that were under control of other colonial powers. When the governor of Timbuktu was sent to investigate, he found a trail of burned villages, hanged villagers, and the charred corpses of roasted children. Eventually, Voulay and Chanoine were killed, and the mission was continued by other officers who refrained from committing the same crimes as Voulay and his men had committed. The number of victims is unknown, but is estimated to run in the thousands. For the Voulay mission and many other military campaigns, a strong colonial army was necessary. While the top positions in the French colonial army were exclusively reserved for those of European heritage, most of the ground troops were filled with soldiers recruited from the local colonized populations. But serving the colonial master was not guarantee for a more humane treatment. During the Battle of France in Europe during the Second World War, France used their colonial subjects to strengthen their military force in Europe. Many North and West African soldiers were captured by the German army. After the liberation of France, these troops were repatriated to Africa. The West African troops were placed in a military camp near Dakar in Senegal. The troops complained about the poor living conditions in the camp and because they had not received any of the pay that they were owed after their service in Europe. After a skirmish in the camp, the soldiers were surrounded and a fusillade ensued that may have killed as many as 300 people. For a long time, the massacre was swept under the rug by the French colonial administration, and even decades after the fall of the French colonial empire, children were not taught about the atrocity. Eventually, later French governments acknowledged the crime. Another colonial massacre took place in the Wadai Sultanate in Chad. After conquering large portions in this part of Africa, the French encountered local resistance, spearheaded by several indigenous sultanates. One of these states was the Wadai Sultanate. Together with other sultanates and tribes, they launched a resistance, but were ultimately defeated by the French colonial forces. The death toll of the fights was immense, with over 300,000 people dying due to armed violence, massacres, epidemics, and famines. The French used several tactics to break local resistance, some more ruthless than others. Unashamed to resort to deception, the French invited community leaders to Abéché in 1917 on the pretext of consulting them on governance matters. At dawn, following morning prayers, hundreds of the invited Muslim scholars were ambushed and killed during the so-called coup massacres. Many of the soldiers were brutally beheaded by the colonial soldiers. Similar massacres were carried out in Varia and Kanim, but the French destroyed more than just the bodies of the local scholars. The colonial forces also confiscated books and manuscripts from libraries, either burning them, sending them to museums in France, or hiding them in underground storage facilities. Several mosques were destroyed, and a wave of arrests, liquidations, and exiles followed that lasted until the 1930s, and colonial rule did not leave Chad until the early 1960s. Another less well-known atrocity concerns the so-called Cameroonian genocide of the Bamileke people. When the Union of the Peoples of Cameroon, an anti-colonial party in French Cameroon, started to gain widespread support amongst the people of Cameroon, the French ordered a string of military campaigns that terrorized the native population and grazed entire villages to the ground. These massacres continued after independence, supported by a puppet government loyal to France. Many villages were burned down, prisoners were beheaded, and thousands of women and children were mercilessly slaughtered. While a definitive death toll will probably never be known, some historians estimate a death toll running into the hundreds of thousands. Cameroon was not the only country confronted with violent actions against independence movements. Tens of thousands in Madagascar were slaughtered during military campaigns against the democratic movement for Malagasy renewal. And between 100,000 and 400,000 civilians perished during the anti-colonial war in French Indochina. But one of the most egregious examples of colonial violence can be found in Algeria's War of Independence. But to understand this war, we need to start from the beginning. In 1830, the French, under the rule of Charles X, set out to conquer Algiers, at that time an independent kingdom, even though it was officially still a part of the Ottoman Empire. From the very beginning, the French's penchant for violence was clear. Over 800,000 Algerians were slaughtered in a long-lasting conquest that would continue until 1903, when the last parts of Algeria were under French control. The indiscriminate violence was so severe some historians consider the conquest a genocide. The French adopted a scorched earth policy, deliberately burning livestock and villages and slaughtering or deporting entire communities to other countries in North Africa, the Middle East, or even overseas territories. The French colonial period in Algeria was characterized by protests and revolts of segments of the native population, not only due to the military violence unleashed on the Algerian civilians, but also due to unequal taxation, political discrimination, destruction of religious sites, and economic exploitation. After World War II, tensions between local political groups and the French colonial regime grew steadily. and the War of Independence broke out after the Algerian National Liberation Front started a series of guerrilla attacks aimed at colonial military and civilian targets. This series started in 1954 on the day later known as the Red All Saints' Day. This event triggered military action by the French Empire. The French systematically used methods of war like the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians, rape, disembowelment of pregnant women, burying people alive, death flights, cutting of genitals, waterboarding, electrocution, and other forms of torture. It is estimated that by the end of the war, over 1 million Algerians lost their lives due to armed massacres, disease, and starvation, and that around 2 million Algerians were forcefully displaced from their homes. Violent suppression of Algerian independence sentiment was, however, not limited to the colony of Algeria itself. On the 17th of October 1961 in Paris, around 30,000 Algerian protesters gathered to voice their support for Algerian independence. This event took place during the Independence War in Algeria, which lasted until 1962. The French National Police, then headed by the infamous Maurice Papon, a former Nazi collaborator turned chief of police, attacked the protesters with unbridled brutality. Some protesters were simply beaten to death, while others were drowned in the River Seine, close to the protests. How many died is still unclear, as no proper official documentation exists, but the death toll may have been as high as 300. In 1962, another protest was violently suppressed by the same police near Charonne metro station, which cost the lives of 9 people. All in all, the ruthless colonial history in Algeria alone probably cost the lives of over 2 million Algerians. The atrocities presented in this video only constitute a part of all colonial atrocities committed by the French Empire, but is enough to convince anyone that the French Empire was one of the most brutal colonial regimes of its kind, with millions perished under its yoke, a blood-stained history that many schools in France do not completely teach, and many people in France remain unaware of. Check out the rest of the channel of more videos on colonial atrocities of other empires such as the Dutch, British, and German colonial regimes. Thanks for watching.